Hey there, Timberwolves. Miss Robolino coming in with another video review for you. And this review is going to be looking at Unit 7, Early Texas Statehood. So let's just go ahead and let's take a look. First, I would like to go ahead and just remind you that this week is going to be a little bit different with how the week is going to go. We are working on final exam schedules, so everyone is going to be taking the test at a different time of the day. Finals start on Tuesday, so please take a look onto Canvas. And if you look at the calendar, it will show you what days are going to be the exams, but to get the exact times of when they're happening, please take a look onto your modules, then you're going to see final exam review. And from there, you'll also be able to see the other videos that I made to be able to kind of help you review for the exam. Okay, so let us go ahead and take a look at this review video. So first, let's just kind of bring it back to the beginning and take a look at Texas annexation. So in the beginning, Texas was its own country. And from there, Texas was going through a huge hardship of trying to be able to stay a country. Many people wanted to be annexed by the United States because many of the citizens inside of Texas were from America. So at this time in Anson Jones administration, he was able to go ahead and work out that annexation process with Texas and President Polk, and in 1845, Texas was annexed into the United States. So there are a lot of causes, and because of this annexation, a lot of it being with debt that they weren't able to afford. Two, there was a lot of hostility between Texas and Mexico. There was also hostility with Texas and the natives. So this was a great opportunity for the United States to be able to come in, annex Texas, and be able to protect Texas. That was one of the main reasons why Texas wanted to be annexed. Another was being able to repay their debt. They had a lot of debt and they were having a huge issue with it, specifically with Malibu Lamar, who rose that debt significantly, which made it very, very difficult. Anson Jones was definitely a supporter of annexation, and he was able to go ahead and achieve that. But because of Texas going into the United States, we start to see that Texas, being a pro-slavery country already, is going to be a huge controversy when it is annexed into the United States. With Texas coming into the United States as well, there are tensions in Congress and issues with Mexico that just started to grow more and more. We're going to go ahead and take a look at those issues as we get further into the review. Now, what we also start to see is once Texas becomes annexed, it is open for many U.S. citizens to live there. And this is pretty big deal into how Texas is going to be cultivated and how it's going to be moving forward inside of U.S. history. But new and cheap land brought many people to Texas for the economic and social opportunities that Texas had. So that is just kind of the background for you, just to kind of set the scene as to kind of what is going on at this time. So let's just go ahead and let's just review about manifest destiny. And if you remember, manifest destiny is the God-given right for the United States to govern the whole continent from the Atlantic to the Pacific. Now, in the beginning, if you can kind of follow along over here, if you can kind of see my mouse, moving over here to the 13 colonies, this was the first beginning of manifest destiny with the United States. We have the original 13 colonies, and due to the French and Indian War and the beginning of it, and the end of it, where the British were able to go ahead and win. They got all this territory right here at the Treaty of Paris of 1783. The British won the French and Indian War, which meant that now all the way up to the Mississippi River over here was territory and belonging to the British colonies. With that happening, many people found it a great opportunity to move further west by the Mississippi and be able to go ahead and settle along that. They were not allowed to go past the Mississippi River because that was still French territory. As time moves on, we're looking at a good 20, 30 years later, we get to see that Napoleon sells this land to Thomas Jefferson because he needs money to be able to go ahead and fight his wars in Europe. So this became another huge impact on Manifest Destiny and where it really started to bloom the most. Thomas Jefferson at this time hires 2 explorers to go and explore this territory and just kind of look what it looks like. And that was with Lewis and Clark expedition. So they were actually able to get to the Pacific coast. And when it came back, that's kind of where that idea of Manifest Destiny really began. The next act of Manifest Destiny that we're starting to see is the Texas annexation. And as I said before, annexing Texas was a big part of completing that Manifest Destiny ideology because it was moving further west. Additionally, we start to see that the U.S.-Mexican War was another source of Manifest Destiny because it allowed America to continue on and gather a number of states in the Mexican secession, as well as continuing to Oregon country over in the northwestern part of the continent. And lastly was the Gadsden Purchase, which was basically purchased by the United States from Mexico in 1853 to be able to continue trade. So a couple of things to kind of think about. One is Manifest Destiny can be seen in multiple ways. It can be seen economically, socially, and politically. So these are really important to understand because you will have to be identifying these inside the exam as well as we continue further on in our journey through Texas history. So let's go ahead and let's just kind of take a look at this. So Manifest Destiny and its economic, social, and political aspects are pretty straightforward, but I just do want to go ahead and just go over economic, social, political with you. So if you remember, economic has to do with economic systems. So you're looking at things like agriculture, which is farming, industrialization, business organizations, labor movements, and anything that has to do with education. Okay, now what this is going to do, these economic aspects are going to be able to help the economy grow. And education meaning like education for jobs. Social is going to be looking at the social and gender roles, family, music, literature, technology, belief systems, religion. So all of these things are going to be able to make up these social classes. So just keep in mind, religion is a huge issue, specifically when we look at the Mormon migration. Now, political is dealing with the idea of like politics. So you have nations, patriotism, empires, rulers, form of governments, revolutions, conflicts, expansion, and ideologies. Any of these ideas are going to be political. And then environmental, which is just kind of dealing with migration, settlement, urbanization, regions, human interaction, environment, and land management. You don't really need to worry about that right now, but we will go ahead and focus on that when you get into U.S. history. So let's go ahead and let's break down what we kind of have learned so far. So when we kind of take a look at Manifest Destiny and kind of how it happened, we start to see there are different things that happened inside of the U.S. history. One was during 1846 with the Oregon Trail. So at this time, many people heard about this amazing land in the Northern Territory of the West. And the U.S. definitely was pushing this because they wanted to go ahead and bring as many Americans in that territory in hopes that the more Americans that were there, it would just be easier to go ahead and annex Oregon much later. So this was known as the Oregon Trail, and the people that moved to the Oregon Territory were known as pioneers. And with them, they traveled these harsh conditions through desert, through cold, through rain, through snow, dealing with whatever they possibly could deal with. Native Americans. You also have obstacles that would happen because there were no roads at this time. So it was just a very treacherous journey. Not everyone was able to make it, but that pioneer spirit to travel on the Oregon Trail would be a social aspect. And the reason why it would be social is because we're looking at people moving out to the Oregon Trail to be able to set up communities, traveling with their families, and the belief system of just kind of continuing the idea of a better life. And in 1849, we have the California Gold Rush. So at this time, gold was found in the San Diego or San Francisco area of California, and this was a great opportunity for many people to come to California for economic riches. So many people rushed at the chance to be able to make as much money as possible, and they just went over to California to start like this new labor movement of just kind of mining. So here we start to see people just kind of creating these miner towns. And eventually, once the gold dries up, you tend to find them as ghost towns now. So these are just kind of really interesting that you can kind of see in the West. And last but not least, we have our Mormon migration into Utah. So at this time, Mormonism is a brand new religion that kind of develops out of New York City. And it is created by this man. His name is Joseph, and he explains that he was met by one of God's angels, and he was just, able to go ahead and continue God's message. So as he began to grow, many followers came, but they were viewed and subjected to a lot of discrimination. So what would happen is Joseph thought that this was not a good time to be able to keep his people here, and heard about the opportunities out west and decided to go ahead and take his people and just kind of move out to the Utah area where they'd be able to build a community and practice their religion without any discrimination or any harassment. So that is a social aspect. So just to kind of give you the idea of people moving out west and the effects of the population growth, we can just kind of see. So the California Trail, when we're looking at, is the gold rush, 250,000 people. So that economic effect of Manifest Destiny, pushing people all the way to California, which is one of the reasons why California was easily annexed as a state. Then we have the Oregon Trail looking at 80,000 people, and that was again to build up that territory with as much American influence as possible to then be able to go ahead and annex it much later down the line. And then our Mormon Trail, which was, with the Mormons traveling to Utah to be able to practice their religion successfully. So these are just some numbers just to kind of show you the effect of Manifest Destiny kind of working its way out west. So as we kind of continue, we start to see the continuing of Manifest Destiny, and that has to come with the political issues that are happening between Mexico and the United States. So Texas annexation into the United States really put Mexico in a, bad place. And the reason why is because they never really recognized Texas as an independent country. And basically they just claimed Texas as their own territory. So when they found out about the treaty created by Texas and the United States, they were just very upset about this. They felt very angry, and they did feel that that was a declaration of war on their point. They did not declare war, but just to kind of show you how angry they were. So at this time, because of Mexico not recognizing Texas as a country, they still believe the Nueces River was the border between Mexico and Texas. And this does become a problem because in the Treaty of Velasco that was signed by in the Treaty of Velasco that was signed by Santa Anna, we start to see that it was not really recognized or considered to be a true treaty to the Mexican people. So to Texas, after Santa Anna signed this treaty, it was stated that the boundary line would be the Rio Grande, and people in Mexico would have to move south of the Rio Grande, kind of starting where Mexico begins. Now, because America supported Texas, they went ahead and also supported the Rio Grande as well. Because Mexico was not really working with the United States on this, there were definitely some issues with people from Mexico crossing the Rio Grande, and the United States and Texas finding this to be against that treaty, as well as being invasion into territory that was not theirs, which is why Zachary Taylor went down to the Rio Grande area by Brownsville, and it ended up in an altercation where Americans were killed on American soil, according to the United States. So please just make sure you do know those two boundaries for your exam. You're looking at the Nueces River, which is the boundary claimed by Mexico, and the Rio Grande, which is the boundary claimed by the United States. So this is one of the major reasons as to why the US-Mexican War started. So what really caused the US-Mexican War? Well, Americans were killed on American soil. Mexico was insulted from Texas annexation. There were border disputes, as mentioned before, unpaid debt from Mexico. So Mexico owed a lot of money to Texas during the Texas Revolution because of all the damage that they accumulated during the runaway scrape and just destroying towns, cities, and everything. Mexico also felt bullied by the United States to sell their northern territory to them. So again, that completion of manifest destiny. So as the United States started to move further and further west, Mexico was kind of in that way of the United States completing their journey to the Pacific coast. So at this time, the United States sent many envoys to speak with the president of Mexico to be able to purchase this northern territory. And Mexico really just was not having it. They were just upset about Texas, so they really did not want to negotiate with the United States. So as you just kind of see, it is a lot of tension between the two countries. What we also start to see is these border disputes are also becoming an issue, and the Treaty of Alaska is not being recognized by Mexico, which is kind of where we see the border disputes and then kind of the relationship between the United States and Mexico. So the war between Mexico and the US was kind of an opportunity for the United States to kind of expand itself and complete the manifest destiny to the Pacific Ocean. So what we just kind of start to see is that the US does take advantage of the opportunity to fight Mexico, knowing that they are technologically more advanced than Mexico. They do have a better army than Mexico, and they have the means to win. So this is just an opportunity that the President Polk just does not want to turn away. So just to kind of explain how things were during the Mexican War, there were a lot of issues during this time. There were many casualties, but just to kind of show you the effects of casualties according to US, we start to see that many were not really coming from being killed in action by wounds or accidents. They were actually becoming more frequent because of disease. Disease was one of the main causes of US deaths inside the Mexican-American War. At this time, sanitation was not exactly held up to the standards that we know today. And because of that, a huge outbreak of yellow fever took place, and it killed over 11,000 soldiers from the disease. So the American Army didn't suffer major debilitating from yellow fever. It was an epidemic. It extracted just a huge, terrible toll on the U.S. It totaling more among American soldiers in the Mexican-American War for being killed in action was 1,192. whereas in deaths by wounds, 529, and then we have our disease from yellow fever, 11,000. So disease claimed a toll 7 times greater than that of Mexican weapons due to poor conditions in the camps. So just looking at that, understanding that, sanitation was not like we know it today. People were unaware about, microbes and, people being sick and just kind of staying away from people who are sick. It was not really known during that time. So there were some negative effects to both the United States and Mexico on the war, mostly Mexico being affected the most. If you could just kind of take a look at the political cartoon at the top in between the two flags, we see that that Mexico is being represented by the Mexican eagle, which is also on the Mexican flag that you can see to your left. And Mexico looks very beautiful, feathers, and we also start to see that they seem very strong. But then to the right by the United States, we see what the United States has done to Mexico. The feathers are basically plucked off. They are gone, and a lot of those feathers are being representing the land lost by Mexico. So Mexico lost more than 50% of its territory. So you can go ahead and just kind of relate those feathers to, the territory that the United States was able to claim and what Mexico lost. We also see that Mexico is very frail and they are very humiliated. They are embarrassed because of this. So Mexico lost its territories, the death of many soldiers. We also see the death of many innocent people inside of Mexico. Mexico was for the worst by the war in all mannerisms. It lost more than 50% of its territory. It also lost much of its stability due to uprisings that took place during and after the war and had to deal with a lot of U.S. interference. Whereas the U.S., some negative effects about the war is it cost them over $100 million. It ended the lives of 13,000 U.S. military personnel, and the war led to disruptions in Congress that just kind of dealt with separating and just causing tensions between the North and the South. And they each had their stance and claim on the issue with slavery. And we're actually getting into that and just seeing kind of how that plays a huge effect inside the United States as it begins to get bigger and bigger. So at the end of the war, with the U.S.-Mexican War, it ends with the Treaty of Guadalupe. Now, basically what's happening is the United States gets this huge amount of land, and they gain all these states of California, Nevada, Utah, parts of Arizona, Colorado, New Mexico, and Wyoming. So at this time, Mexico, with the treaty, has to abandon all claims to Texas. They can no longer claim Texas. They also have to accept the Rio Grande as the border, and anyone who wishes to live in Mexico needs to move south of that border. Mexico will surrender all territory between western Texas and the Pacific, which is that Mexican secession. Just please make sure you know what the Mexican secession is for your exam. So in this return, the United States is going to pay Mexico $15 million for the secession and then pay off the debt that Mexico owes to Texas from the Texas Revolution. And then Mexicans living in the seceded territory would be given U.S. citizenship and be protected under U.S. Constitution. Those people who did not want to stay inside of the United States had the option to leave, and they had a year to do so. A couple of things to kind of take note here is the people that were living inside this territory that chose to stay were under the influence that, or under the understanding that they were going to be protected. We're going to come to find out that this is not really true. And we're just going to kind of take a look at the perspective of those moving out west into this particular territory and the discrimination that they are just kind of putting forth on the people that have been living in this territory before it became part of the United States. So the United States has always had a history of being unbalanced. It's always been tensions between the North and the South, and kind of how can a state be able to say what is allowed in one state and what's not allowed in another. And I just wanted to go ahead and give you a brief history lesson on this with the Missouri Compromise. Okay, so this just kind of gives you the idea of the tensions that have been building up the United States since the Missouri Compromise, which is who is going to have more power in Congress and how are they going to able to keep that balance. Now, if you remember, the Mexican secession and Texas brings in a whole new issue. And the reason why is because we have all these new territories that are looking to become part of the United States. If you remember going back into our slide, we have these large amounts of migrations into the United States, kind of moving into California, Oregon Territory, Texas, and other specific territory that is just kind of growing. And these people want to go ahead and be part of the United States. Now, how are they going to enter and how is that going to play off into the United States? Which kind of brings us to the Compromise of 1850. So at this time, to prevent issues going off in Congress and to make sure things were fair, Texas was going to enter in as a slave state, and which does make sense because the migration of many southeastern people coming into Texas and Texas already having slavery established inside the state would make sense of why they would come in that way. But as the Mexican secession happened and California had a huge amount of people moving into, if you remember, there were over 200,000 people moving to California at that time. California would enter in as a free state, which would then go ahead and even the balance inside of Congress. Does it really stop the country from going into a war? It does for right now, but eventually what's going to happen is we're going to see a huge battle happen inside of Congress, and we're going to see a civil war break out. In the meantime, the other territories that will eventually become part of the United States will then choose what they're going to enter in much later. And then from there, we'll go ahead and kind of see how that happens as we move further on into the Civil War. Lastly, we start to see the effects of U.S. migration into Texas. As I mentioned before in the last slide, we see that majority of the people are coming from eastern United States. So areas like Virginia, the Carolinas, Georgia, and most of these southeastern states, they bring with them slaves, their ideologies, their expertise in agriculture, cheap land, and the hopes that the economic opportunity are going to be able to help them, grow more wealthy. So this brings in a lot of things inside to Texas. One of the effects of this U.S. migration is going to be on the Native American population, the African American population, and the Tejano population. So with Native Americans, we see that they are severely discriminated against by the U.S. government and citizens. You need to remember that majority of the Native Americans are living a different life that what we may come to know ourselves as. They are usually nomadic, they hunt, they gather, and they are used to their traditional lands. Because there are many Native American groups inside the United States, they have their specific lands that they hunt over. Now, if they go into these other territories by other natives, it begins to start these tribal wars. So what we're starting to see is there is a lot of lost land inside the Native population. Many of these U.S. migrants push a lot of these Native Americans out, and the U.S. migrants want these lands because they are really fertile and they're really good for agricultural purposes, keeping the idea open that most of these people are coming from southern states, which is primarily agriculture. Many conflicts begin to uprise between the U.S. citizens and the Native Americans over these land rights. And the U.S. is obviously going to go ahead and support these citizens and push the Native Americans out of Texas. So the U.S. does want many of the Native American populations to leave, which is why they never really allow them back into Texas. Another one we're going to be looking at is the African American population. So if you remember, Mexico at the time does not allow slavery into its domain. But Texas at the time, when it was part of Mexico, was able to go ahead and attract many free African Americans from the United States. Knowing that the United States allowed slavery really changed the way things were. And it allowed many African Americans to go ahead and start a life inside of Texas. What we do start to see is many of the people coming in from the United States who were primarily Anglo did bring discrimination into Texas. But once Texas is fully annexed into the United States, we start to see that the rights of these free men is completely taken away. So African Americans at this time are enslaved, or they're going to be threatened to be enslaved even though they are free. Many of the African Americans at this time are having low education, specifically if they are enslaved Africans. They are treated poorly and unfair, and many African Americans who were free left to Mexico to avoid the conflict of being enslaved again. If you remember from our activities inside of class, we learned that many Africans lost their rights once the U.S. Annexed Texas. And the last group that was discriminated against was the Tejanos. So they were discriminated against by the U.S. citizens because they were viewed as inferior. So inferior is one of your vocab words, which means that they are beneath. They were not protected by U.S. law at this time, even though they should have been with the Treaty of Hidalgo. Many were forced to flee to Mexico, such as Juan Seguin. If you remember, Juan Seguin is a really important figure inside of Texas history. He fought for Texas to be free from Mexico. He signed the Convention of 1836, and he worked with trying to keep Texas as a country. And he was forced out of his home and his birthplace, which was inside of Texas, because of the fact that he was Tejano. He was discriminated against, and many of the U.S. citizens in Texas wanted the land that the Tejanos had, and so they wanted them to leave. So the discrimination kind of pushed many of them out and didn't really give them the rights that they were promised in the Treaty of Guadalupe Hidalgo. So we start to see that Texas also opens up to the world as well. Many people were excited to come to Texas because of the opportunities that it had. So let's just go ahead and let's take a look at these few groups that come into Texas. So one of the first people that come into Texas are the Irish. They go far back to the old 300. So the Irish helped fight in the Texas Revolution and the U.S.-Mexican War, and other immigrants moved to Texas due to the potato famine. That is something really important to understand because the potato famine, a famine is when a food source is completely diminished or diseased, which means the population in that country is going to starve. So many people came to the United States for obviously reasons of survival. Many of them settled along the coast between Corpus Christi and Refugio. The next group that we're starting to see is the Polish immigrants who came into Texas because they wanted to escape poverty in Poland. Poland at this time is being under control of Russia during the Romanov Empire. And at this time, because the Polish were very different with some religion and then obviously some language, they were treated very poorly. The French came into Texas during this time as well for economic and political conditions inside of France. France is going through a huge industrial revolution at this time, and we're starting to see that many people were not able to go ahead and live a very comfortable and safe life inside of France as France began to grow and become more urbanized. One of the biggest groups that came into Texas were the German immigrants. They were the largest and had the largest impact on Texas. In fact, where they settled became known as the German Belt. The Germans heard many amazing stories about this paradise of cheap land, fertile soil, and warm winters, which kind of attracted them to come to Texas. So many of them did come for religious persecution and political refugees, and they settled in the areas of um, Frank Frankenstein and New Braunfels, which is kind of really important to know. The Czech also came into Texas, and they came in because of cheap and fertile land. They settled near Waco as well as areas of southeast San Antonio. The Norwegian people came into Texas because of a better economic and social conditions for them. They settled in northeast Texas. So all of these people that came into Texas are coming from Europe. So Europe is a continent that stretches from Portugal all the way to Russia. And all of these people came in for better social and economic possibilities that Texas had to offer. And our non-European country, which has always been settled by people from Mexico. So Texas and Mexico have always had a relationship with each other, and it dates back all the way to Martin de Leon and the Mexican impresario system, which attracted many Mexicans to come into Texas because of the cheap land. Other Mexican populations were found along the Rio Grande and El Paso area. So just please understand the importance of the immigration movement. Now, how did people from Europe get to the United States? Well, during this time, planes were not created yet until the early 1900s. So many people are coming over by boat, and they're taking a boat into the Gulf Coast to be able to go ahead and get to Texas right away. Well, Timberwolves, this basically ends our review video, which I know has been super long, but it really goes over everything that you need to know. Please make sure you familiarize yourself with the other topics that are going to be on your exam, and you can find that information in the other review videos. Until then, happy studying.